The year is 1943. Deep in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, where the snow runs red and the air tastes like gunpowder and death, Soviet soldiers are experiencing something they cannot explain. They advance across open fields, and before the crack of gunfire even registers in their ears, entire squads are already falling. Not from artillery, not from mortars, from something else, something that sounds less like a weapon and more like the world itself being torn apart. The eye. Germans call it Hitler's Säge, Hitler's Buzzsaw. The Soviets, they just call it death. But on a bitter winter morning in a captured Wehrmacht position outside Stalingrad, 3 Soviet engineers are about to uncover a secret that will change everything they thought they knew about modern warfare. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what you know about World War II weaponry. Now, let me take you back to one of the most pivotal moments in military history. A moment when Soviet pride collided with German precision, and nothing would ever be the same. This is not just a story about a machine gun. This is a story about obsession. About the moment when an entire military doctrine was forced to confront its own inadequacy. About 3 men who took apart a weapon bolt by bolt, screw by screw, and discovered not just how it worked, but why the Red Army had been bleeding for 2 years straight. The MG42 wasn't just a bin gun. It was a philosophy made metal. And the day Soviet mechanics finally understood it was the day they glimpsed into the very soul of their enemy. What they found wasn't brutality. It wasn't savagery. It was something far more terrifying. It was efficiency perfected. Senior Lieutenant Dmitri Volkov wasn't supposed to be there. At 38 years old, he was older than most frontline officers, his hands more comfortable holding drafting tools than rifles. Before the war, Volkov had been a mechanical engineer at the Tula arms plant, designing improvements for the Maxim gun and the DP-27 light machine gun. He understood weapons the way a poet understands words, intuitively, passionately, completely. When Germany invaded in 1941, Volkov volunteered immediately, but the Red Army had other plans. They needed his mind, not his trigger finger. So they sent him to the front as a technical observer, tasking him with examining captured enemy equipment and reporting back to Moscow. It was unglamorous work, shuffling through frozen trenches with a notebook and calipers, while other men fought and died. But Volkov understood something that few others did. Wars are won not just by brave men, but by better machines. On January 15, 1943, Volkov received orders to examine a German machine gun nest that had been overrun during a brutal night assault. 23 Soviet soldiers had died taking that position. 23 lives to silence 1 gun. When Volkov arrived at the site, escorted by 2 young privates, Anatoly Petrov, a farm boy from Ukraine, and Sergei Karpov, a factory worker from Leningrad, he expected to find the standard German MG42. Effective, yes. Reliable, certainly. But nothing the Red Army couldn't match with their own weapons. What he found instead was something that made his engineer's heart skip a beat and his soldiers' blood run cold. The weapon sat there in the frozen bunker like a sleeping predator, its dark metal glinting in the weak winter light filtering through the shattered logs overhead. Scattered around it were empty shell casings, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands, forming a brass carpet that crunched under Volkov's boots. The belt feed mechanism was still intact, frozen in mid-operation. Petrov, the young Ukrainian private, whistled low. "Comrade Lieutenant, how much ammunition did they have here?" Volkov didn't answer immediately. He was counting, calculating in his head. His expression shifted from curiosity to something approaching horror. This single gun fired more rounds in yesterday's engagement than an entire Soviet rifle company carries into battle, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. And they changed the barrel 3 times during the fight. 3 times. Karpov, the Leningrad factory worker, frowned. Is that even possible? Volkov knelt beside the weapon, running his gloved hand along its length with something approaching reverence. According to everything I know about machine gun design, no. The barrel should have melted. The action should have ceased. The gun should have torn itself apart. He looked up at the 2 young soldiers, and they saw something unfamiliar in their officer's eyes. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the look of a man who has just realized his understanding of the world was fundamentally incomplete. "Gentlemen," Volkov said quietly, "we need to take this back to our lines. Every piece, every screw. And then we need to figure out how the Germans built a weapon that shouldn't be possible." The journey back to Soviet lines with the captured MG42 was treacherous. German snipers still controlled the ruins to the east, and the three men had to move through the frozen twilight, carrying the disassembled weapon in canvas bags, trying not to lose a single component in the snow. Volkov treated each piece like it was made of glass, wrapping the bolt assembly in his own scarf, cradling the receiver against his chest. When they finally reached the relative safety of a reinforced bunker being used as a field workshop, Volkov commandeered a wooden table, cleared it with a sweep of his arm that sent maps and meal tins clattering to the floor, and began the most important examination of his life. He worked through the night, and as dawn broke gray and cold over the eastern front, Anatoly and Sergei watched their lieutenant's hands move with surgical precision, laying out each component in careful order: the barrel, the bolt assembly, the feed mechanism, the trigger group, the buttstock, every spring, every pin, every seemingly insignificant piece of stamped metal. And as the weapon revealed itself, component by component, Volkov's expression changed. The initial curiosity gave way to concentration, then to disbelief, then to something that looked almost like betrayal. "It's stamped," Volkov muttered, more to himself than to the two privates watching him. "Most of it is just stamped sheet metal." Karpov leaned forward. "Stamped? Like pressed?" "Yes," Volkov replied, his voice tight. "See this receiver? This isn't machined from a solid block like our Maxim guns. They took flat sheets of steel, stamped them into shape, welded them together. It's a technique we use for shovels, for helmets, for things that don't need precision." He looked up, his eyes wide. "But this does need precision. This needs to channel enormous forces, contain extreme heat, maintain perfect alignment through thousands of rounds. And they did it with stamped metal and spot welds." Anatoly frowned, trying to understand. "But Comrade Lieutenant, isn't that simpler? Cheaper?" "Exactly." Volkov's voice rose with barely controlled emotion. "Don't you see? It takes a Soviet factory 3 days of skilled labor to machine one Maxim receiver. 3 days. And here the Germans have created a weapon that's not just as good, it's better. And they can stamp out the IVs parts in hours. This isn't just a machine gun. This is industrial warfare perfected. This is how you arm an entire nation while your factories are being bombed and your resources are stretched thin. This is genius." The tension in that bunker was palpable. Here was a Soviet officer, a proud engineer who had spent his adult life designing weapons for the motherland, staring at an enemy creation with something uncomfortably close to admiration. But Volkov wasn't finished. As he moved to the bolt assembly, his hands actually trembled. "Look at this," he said, his voice dropping to an awed whisper. "Look at this locking mechanism." He held up the bolt, turning it slowly in the lamplight so the others could see. "See these rollers? When you fire the weapon, the bolt doesn't lock with lugs like our guns. Instead, these rollers are forced outward into recesses in the receiver. The pressure from firing pushes the rollers out, which locks everything solid. But as the pressure drops, the rollers cam inward and the bolt unlocks smoothly. It's called a roller-delayed blowback system." Sergei scratched his head. "And that's good?" Volkov actually laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Good? It's revolutionary. It allows for a rate of fire we didn't think possible with this size weapon. 1,200 rounds per minute. Maybe even 1,500 in optimal conditions. Our DP-27 manages about 550. Our Maxims might reach 600. This thing fires so fast that the human ear can't distinguish individual shots. It just sounds like one continuous roar, like a buzzsaw cutting through steel." He set the bolt down gently, almost reverently. "Every Soviet soldier who's ever said the Germans had machine guns that sounded different, that sounded wrong, they weren't imagining it. This is why. This is the buzzsaw." For 3 days Volkov barely slept. He measured every dimension, he calculated tolerances, he sketched diagrams by candlelight while Anatoly and Sergei brought him tea and rations he barely touched. Other officers came by, curious about the obsessed engineer and his captured prize, but Volkov waved them away. He was a man possessed, diving deeper and deeper into the German weapons' secrets, and what he found only deepened his troubled fascination. The barrel change system was perhaps the most elegant solution Volkov had ever encountered in his life. Soviet machine guns had barrels that were threaded, requiring tools and time to replace when they overheated. The German MG42? The barrel simply lifted out after releasing a single latch on the side of the receiver. Volkov timed himself. 7 seconds. 7 seconds to swap a white-hot barrel for a cool one and get back into action. They designed this to be operated by a two-man team, Volkov explained to an increasingly interested audience of Soviet officers who had gathered in the bunker. The gunner fires. The assistant gunner carries spare barrels. When the gun starts to overheat, which at 1500 rounds per minute happens very quickly, the gunner calls for a barrel change. The assistant slaps a new barrel in. 7 seconds, maybe 10 if you're under heavy fire and your hands are shaking. Then you're back in action. A major from the artillery corps shook his head in disbelief. And the barrel can handle that kind of abuse? The individual barrel? No, Volkov admitted. Each barrel can only fire a few hundred rounds before it needs to cool. But that's the genius of it. They didn't try to build an indestructible barrel. They built a system that makes barrels disposable and replaceable. The gun never stops firing. You just keep rotating fresh barrels through it. The weapon itself is immortal. But it was the feed mechanism that finally broke something inside Dmitri Volkov. He had saved it for last, perhaps knowing instinctively that this would be the hardest piece to accept. The MG42 fed from either side, left or right, making it adaptable to any position. The belt links were clever, simple, foolproof. But more than that, the feed mechanism had been designed with a level of thought that bordered on psychological warfare. Volkov cleared his throat, and the bunker fell silent. Gentlemen, I need to tell you something that you may not want to hear, but that you must understand if we are going to survive this war. He paused, choosing his words carefully. This weapon was designed not just to kill efficiently, but to break the enemy's will to advance. Think about it from the perspective of a Soviet infantryman ordered to charge across an open field. You've trained with rifles. You know what gunfire sounds like. You know that if you're fast, if you're lucky, if you move when the gunner is reloading, or when his barrel overheats, you might make it across. You might close the distance. You might reach the enemy position. Volkov's voice dropped lower, more intense. But the MG42 changes everything. You start your charge, and you hear it. Not the crack, crack, crack of individual shots, but a continuous brrrr that doesn't stop. The man next to you goes down. Then the man next to him. Then 3 more. And the sound doesn't stop. There's no pause for reloading. No chance to advance while the gunner clears a jam or changes a barrel. Just that endless, tearing roar. How long do you keep running toward that sound? How long before the human mind breaks and says, no, I will not run toward certain death? The Yassi bunker was absolutely silent. Every man there had been in that charge. Every man there had heard that sound and felt that terror. Major Konstantin Fedorov, a decorated infantry officer with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, finally spoke. His voice was hard, almost hostile. So what are you saying, Comrade Lieutenant? That we should be impressed by the German gun? That we should admire the efficiency with which it kills our brothers? Volkov met the major's gaze without flinching. I'm saying, Major, that we need to understand it. Not admire it, not fear it, understand it. He gestured to the disassembled weapon on the table. Every piece of this gun represents a choice the Germans made. They chose stamping over machining because they needed volume. They chose the roller lock system because they needed rate of fire. They chose the quick change barrel because they needed sustained fire. Every choice has a reason, and every choice has a weakness. Fedorov leaned forward. Interested now. What weaknesses? Volkov allowed himself a small smile. The rate of fire that makes it so terrifying? It also means the gun consumes ammunition at an unsustainable rate. A single MG42 gunner can fire through an entire crate of ammunition, 1,200 rounds, in under a minute. The Wehrmacht's logistics have to be extraordinary to keep these guns fed. When their supply lines are cut, when ammunition runs low, that advantage disappears. He picked up the bolt assembly again. The roller lock system is elegant, but it's also sensitive. It needs proper lubrication. In extreme cold or when it's clogged with mud, conditions we can create and exploit, it can malfunction. The stamped construction makes the weapon light and quick to produce, but also less robust than our milled steel designs. And that quick change barrel system? It requires spare barrels. When a German gun position runs out of spare barrels, they're finished. The mood in the bunker began to shift. What had been despair and resentful admiration was transforming into something else. The hard-eyed calculation of professional soldiers finding an enemy's vulnerabilities. But Volkov wasn't finished. He had one more revelation, and this one would be the most difficult for his Soviet colleagues to accept. He took a deep breath and continued. But there's something else. Something that goes beyond this specific weapon. The MG42 represents a completely different philosophy of warfare than ours. He looked around at the gathered officers. Our doctrine is based on mass. Mass armies, mass production, mass heroism. We build sturdy weapons that can take abuse, and we build millions of them. We train millions of soldiers, and we overwhelm the enemy with sheer numbers and determination. It has worked. It is working. We are pushing the Germans back. Volkov paused, his next words coming slowly, painfully. But the Germans have taken a different path. They've realized that in industrial warfare, the side that can multiply the effectiveness of each individual soldier has an enormous advantage. One MG42, properly positioned and supplied, can do the work of 10 or 20 riflemen. This frees up those other soldiers for other tasks. It allows a smaller force to hold a larger front. It turns warfare into a mathematics problem. And mathematics doesn't care about courage or ideology. It just is. Major Fedorov's face had gone dark. Are you suggesting, Comrade Lieutenant, that German engineering is superior to Soviet courage? The tension in the room spiked. This was dangerous territory. In Stalin's Soviet Union, suggesting that any aspect of the German war machine was superior could be construed as defeatism, even treason. But Volkov had gone too far to turn back now. I'm suggesting, Major, that courage without wisdom is just waste. And wisdom means learning from your enemy. His voice grew stronger, more passionate. Do you know what I see when I look at this weapon? I see German engineers who looked at the machine gun problem and asked themselves, how do we make this faster, cheaper, more effective? They weren't bound by tradition. They weren't afraid to abandon techniques that had worked in the past if something better was possible. They experimented, they innovated, they took risks with new materials and new designs. Volkov's eyes blazed now. And do you know what I see when I look at Soviet weapons development? I see bureaucracy. I see factory managers who won't change production lines because it might affect their quotas. I see designers who are afraid to propose radical changes because they might be accused of wrecking or sabotage. I see a system that values conformity over innovation, that punishes failure more than it rewards success. The bunker was deathly quiet. Anatoly and Sergei looked terrified. Several officers were staring at Volkov like he had lost his mind. To speak this way, to criticize the Soviet system so openly, was insane. It was career-ending, possibly life-ending. But Major Fedorov surprised everyone. Instead of denouncing Volkov, he laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the bunker's walls. You are either the bravest man I've ever met, Comrade Lieutenant, or the most foolish. He stepped closer to the table, looking down at the disassembled MG42. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, meant only for Volkov and those closest. But you're not wrong. I've been fighting on this front for 2 years. I've seen what this weapon does to my men. And I've asked myself 1,000 times, why don't we have anything like it? He looked up at Volkov. Now you're telling me we could have. If only we weren't afraid to try something new. If only we rewarded our engineers for thinking differently instead of punishing them for deviation. Volkov nodded slowly. The MG42 isn't just a weapon, Major. It's a mirror. When we look at it, we see our enemy's strengths, yes. But we also see our own weaknesses, reflected back at us. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge? Fedorov straightened up, his military bearing returning. We learn, we adapt, and we survive. He turned to address the room. Everything discussed here stays here. If word gets back to Moscow that we were praising German equipment, we'll all be shot. But among ourselves, as professional soldiers trying to win this war, we can be honest. This gun is better than what we have. Now, Comrade Lieutenant, tell us how we beat it. And there it was. The turning point. The moment when Soviet pride transformed into Soviet pragmatism. Volkov felt something release in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying since he first laid eyes on the MG42. He wasn't being accused of defeatism or treason. He was being asked to be a soldier and an engineer, to take what he'd learned and turn it into victory. Tactics first, Volkov began, his voice taking on the methodical tone of a lecturer. The MG42's rate of fire is both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It consumes ammunition at a rate that would bankrupt a small nation. So we target their supply lines, we hit their ammunition depots, we ambush their supply convoys. A German machine gun position without ammunition is just 3 soldiers sitting in a hole. He picked up one of the barrels. Second, we exploit the barrel change weakness. Yes, they can swap barrels quickly. But there's still a window, 10, maybe 15 seconds, when the gun is not firing. Our doctrine should change. Instead of one massive charge that gets slaughtered, we use probing attacks to force barrel changes. We make them burn through their spare barrels. Once they run out, once that gun overheats and seizes, that's when we hit them with everything. Volkov's mind was racing now. Tactical possibilities unfolding. Third, weather and environment. This weapon is precision engineered. It doesn't like mud. It doesn't like extreme cold without proper lubrication. We fight in winter. We fight in swamps. We make the battlefield as hostile as possible to their precision machines. Captain Yuri Baranov, a quiet tank officer who had been listening intently, spoke up. But what about our own weapons, Comrade Lieutenant? Can we build something similar? Volkov set down the barrel and met the captain's gaze. That's the question that will haunt me for the rest of my life, Captain. Can we? Yes, absolutely. The Germans didn't discover alien technology. Every piece of this gun is based on principles we understand. Should we? Without question. Will we? He shrugged helplessly. That's not up to me. That's up to the design bureaus in Moscow, the factory managers, the political commissars who approve production changes. I will write my report. I will send my detailed drawings and calculations. I will recommend that we develop a similar weapon system immediately. But whether anyone listens, he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Sergei, the young factory worker from Leningrad, who had been silent throughout most of this discussion, finally found his voice. May I say something, Comrade Lieutenant? Volkov nodded. In Leningrad, before the siege, I worked at the Kirov plant. We made tanks. And I remember the engineers always complaining about how the system worked. Every new idea had to go through committees. Every design change required approvals from people who'd never worked a lathe in their lives. Innovation was hard. But you know. What else I remember? He looked around at the officers. I remember that when the siege started, when the Germans surrounded the city and we were starving and freezing, those same engineers found ways to keep the tank lines running. They improvised. They made parts from scrap metal. They simplified designs so unskilled workers could build them. When survival was on the line, the bureaucracy disappeared and genius emerged.